Hello, everybody. Good evening and welcome to Words 2020. I'm Rebecca Zanbergen, host of CBC Radio's London Morning here in London at 93.5 FM. I'm extremely pleasured and honored to be able to welcome esteemed author Wade Davis with us now. Thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who don't know, Wade is a prolific writer, a prolific traveler, an anthropologist. He's written more than now, Wade, I've checked your biography and I've read many articles about you, and they all have varying number of books. So I'm going to say 24 books. Do you have an actual number for me?
I think you're close. It's 23, I think.
23 books. Okay, so that's good. So Wade is a member of the Order of Canada and was the explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society for a decade. His latest book, the book we're talking about today, is called Magdalena, River of Dreams. It's been called A Love Letter to Colombia. In fact, in 2018, he became an honorary citizen of Colombia. And that's the book we're talking about tonight. But if you haven't checked out the article, and we talked about it on our morning show today. I just have to mention it, The Unraveling of America. It's worth checking out, particularly at this time we're in this week. So please welcome and give a warm round of applause. If you're on your couch at home, welcome Wade Davis.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'll just do a little quick screens share here with y'all. You know, what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to give a little bit of a presentation with some images to give you a sense of the book for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then I'll give a chance for Rebecca and I to chat about the book and other things, including that Rolling Stone piece if it comes up. And we had a great visit this morning on the radio precisely about that Rolling Stone piece in the US election. But for the moment, I want to tell you about this book, Magdalena, River of Dreams. You know, I think travelers often become enchanted with the first country that sort of captures their hearts and gives them license to be free. And for me, it was Colombia. There was something about this unbelievably rich landscape, the three arms of the Andean Cordillera running away north to the Caribbean coastal plain, the vast Amazonian forests the size of France, the limitless llanos or the great plains of the northeast of the country, and the thousands of shimmering wetlands that are like mirrors to the heavens. It's the richest country in the world in terms of biodiversity, ecological diversity, geographical diversity, and indeed, one could say, cultural diversity. And this strange kind of love affair between a Canadian lad and a country began innocently enough in 1968 when my mother, a simple but determined Canadian woman, told me that Spanish was a language of the future. And she worked all year to save enough money to be able to allow me to join a small group of schoolboys who were being taken by a teacher to Colombia. And in 1968, at a time when most Canadians had never been in an airplane, the South American destination was terribly exotic. And I was at 14 the youngest of the group and by far the most fortunate because, as opposed to the others who sort of spent a sweltering season in the streets of Cali, Colombia, I was billeted with a family high above the city at the edge of trails that reached west to the Pacific. And it was a kind of a classic Colombian scene, you know, children too numerous to keep track of, an indulgent father, a grandmother who muttered to herself on a porch overlooking fruit trees and flower beds, an angelic sister who more than once carried her brother and me home half drunk, to a mother kind beyond words who stood at the garden gate feigning anger as she tapped her foot on the stone steps. And for 8 weeks, a long time in a 14-year-old's life, I encountered the warmth and decency of a people kind of charged with a strange intensity, a passion for life, and a quiet acceptance of the frailty of the human experience. And it turned out that several of the other older Canadian lads became what the Colombians say, suffering from mamitis or homesickness. And I, by contrast, felt that I had finally found home. And 6 years later, in the early spring of 1974, I returned to Colombia with a one-way ticket, a small backpack of clothes, and only two books, Lawrence's Taxonomy of Vascular Plants and Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. And at the time, I actually felt that bliss was an objective state that you could achieve simply by opening yourself unabashedly to the world. And I, both figuratively and literally, I drank from every stream, even from tire tracks in the road. And naturally, I was constantly sick, but that even seemed part of the process. You know, malarial fevers that broke in the night and arose again with the dawn. And at one point, on a whim, I accepted a commission to guide a journalist across the notorious Darien Gap. And after a month in the jungle, often with up to our necks in swamps and literally dealing with anaconda thieves and jaguar, I kind of emerged from the other side of the notorious gap and arrived in Panama City with only the ragged clothes on my back, $3 by name, and my body completely drenched from vomit from the various passengers in that small plane that had gone through a turbulent storm en route to the city. But I had never felt more alive. And along the way, I fell into the orbit of this legendary botanical explorer, Richard Evans Schultes, who himself had found his life in Colombia. And years later, when I wrote his biography, a book that came out in 96 as One River in Canada, but in 2002, in a beautiful translation by a Colombian poet, Nicolas Sescuan, in Colombia under the title El Rio, it was inevitable that it would be a kind of love letter to a nation by then scorned by the world. 2002 marked a low point in Colombia's fortunes, and at a time when the very nation's capacity to endure was being called into question, a book on botany, botanical exploration, and ethnography hardly warranted attention. But its secret power was the quality of the poetic translation. And for two generations of young Colombians, it became kind of a map of dreams, an account of travels of a young man who went places through the hinterland of their country where they, because of the conflict, could not go. And by the time it came out, Colombia was very much a pariah nation. And Colombians, most of whom have never seen, let alone used cocaine, had been living with the consequences of the trade for two generations. Um, Over 220,000 had been killed in a three-way civil war. 7 million people had been displaced from their homes. And I just think about how Americans would feel about their casual consumption of cocaine in bars and boardrooms across the country, not to mention their hideous war on drugs. If, as a consequence of both obsessions, no fewer than 85 million Americans were forced to flee their homes and, in many cases, their country. But that's what indeed happened to um, Colombians, most of whom were simply victims in a war that over 50 years would kill 220,000 people. There were never more than 200, 300,000 combatants in a nation of 50 million. So most Colombians were simply caught in the vice of war, a war that would have not lasted without the obscene profits of the cocaine trade. At the height of Escobar's power, the Medellin cartel was putting 80 tons of cocaine into America every month, generating $70 million a day. Their accountants budgeted $1,000 a week just to buy elastic bands to wrap the illicit cash. In the last year before the signing of the peace agreement in Havana and its recognition in Cartagena in 2016, the FARC, one of the major leftist groups that came to that agreement, were down to 6,000 cadre, mostly teenagers in search of a good meal. And yet, in the last year of the conflict, the FARC generated $600 million through extortion, much of it through drug trafficking, much of that through the illicit distribution and production of cocaine. Well, if you give me $600 million and the London Boy Scouts, I can wreak havoc throughout southern Ontario. The truth of the matter is, cocaine has been Colombia's curse, but the ultimate responsibility for the blood that is on the hands of so many people in Colombia, those who have died, those who have been slaughtered, lies with those who use illicit cocaine and all the countries that make possible the trade by prohibiting its distribution while doing nothing seriously to curb its use in any way. And after $1 trillion being spent on the war on drugs, there are more people around the world using more drugs in worse ways than ever before. And the irony, of course, is that the source of this alkaloid, cocaine hydrochloride, is the most extraordinary plant in South America, known always as the divine leaf of immortality, and used for 5,000 years with no evidence of toxicity or addiction. Coca is a sacred plant, a benign stimulant that is chock full of vitamins, more calcium than any other plant studied by science, enzymes that facilitate the ability of the body to digest carbohydrate at high elevation. It was a sacred plant, but also an essential component of the traditional Andean diet. A plant that, again, has been used with no evidence of toxicity. And to compare coca with cocaine would be as absurd as comparing potatoes with vodka, or the luscious fruit of a peach with the poisonous cyanogenic glycosides found in the pit of the peach. And the point of all this is Colombia is not a place of violence and war and drugs. Indeed, it's a place of colores y cariño, where the people have endured this horrible war imposed upon them precisely by their character, which is itself informed by an enduring spirit of place, a kind of deep love of a land that, in fact, is the most bountiful on earth. There is no place in Colombia more than a day's travel from every known ecological formation known to exist on the planet. And through all these years of turbulence, the country, in an extraordinary way, has maintained its civil society and its democracy, greened its cities, sought restitution with indigenous people, created millions of acres of national parks, and paved the way for an economic renaissance of unparalleled precedent as literally 2 generations of young people return to the country from capitals around the world with skill sets in every conceivable endeavor. And in the wake of the peace, one of the extraordinary realizations is that because of the conflict, vast areas of the country were literally off limits for industrial development. And so, whereas, for example, in the neighboring country of Ecuador, decisions made in the 1970s about oil extraction, the construction of pipelines, colonization, deforestation have absolutely transformed what was once the Eden of the nation. And Colombia's Amazon, by contrast, though now under threat, is virtually the size of France, and it remains completely roadless, the most extraordinary expanse of pristine rainforest in a basin the size of the face of the full moon. And so Colombians have been given this amazing reprieve over 50 years. And now they can make decisions about the landscape informed by not just 50 years of science that recognizes the wonder of biodiversity and the importance of the Amazon in particular, but also by a new understanding of the wisdom of the elders, the voices of indigenous people who today number more in Colombia than they did at the time of the Spanish conquest. And these are not vestigial societies. These are societies that are dynamic, living, and part of a national dialogue that, upon which will determine the future of the country, but also the future of the world. And as Colombians chart their way forward, everything in a sense hangs in the balance. And some months ago, outside of Santa Marta on the Don Diego River, in a small Arahuaco community, an old friend of mine, Camilo, Mamo Camilo. Now he's a member of the Arahuaco, one of the 3 Chibchen-speaking indigenous societies of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, the highest coastal mountain range on earth that soars over the Caribbean coastal plain. They are descendants of the ancient Tairona civilization, vanquished by the Spanish in the 16th century. In the wake of that defeat and that horrible war, they fled into the mountains, where over 300 years in isolation, they reinvented themselves as a devotional culture of peace. To this day, in a bloodstained continent, they remain free of conquest. They remain ruled by a ritual priesthood the training for which is austere in the extreme. They maintain literally that their prayers and rituals maintain the cosmic balance of the world. And it's humbling to think that 500 years after the conquest, this complex of societies still peer down on the very beaches where Columbus landed his men on the third voyage in 1497. And they are there to inform the Colombians of the proper way of moving into the future. As Mamo Camilo shared with me, peace will not matter if it's only an excuse for the three sides of the conflict to maintain a war with nature. The time has come to make peace with the entire natural world. And that was a message that carried me back to write this book about the Magdalena, the Mississippi of Colombia, a river that runs 1,000 miles from the south to the north, from the rugged knot of mountains of the Macizo Colombiano that gives birth to so many of the great rivers of Colombia, but also to the three arms of the Cordillera that rise up and then go north toward that Caribbean coastal plain. You know, Colombia is a land where nothing happens as expected, a totally surrealistic cultural landscape. And a short story by Jorge Luis Borges, a European woman, asks a professor from Bogota what it means to be Colombian. And the man hesitates before replying, I don't know. It's an act of faith. And Colombia is like that. Nothing as is as expected. Magical realism, celebrated as Colombia's gift to Latin American literature, is within the country simply journalism. Gabo was a practicing journalist all of his life. He was an observer who just happened to live in a land where heaven and earth converge on a regular basis to reveal glimpses of the divine. Only in Colombia can one wash ashore in a coastal desert, follow waterways through wetlands as wide as the sky, ascend narrow tracks through dense tropical forests, and reach in a week Andean valleys as gently verdant and bucolic as anything to be found in the old world. Cities as cultured as any in the Americas were for most of their history linked one to the other only by the tracks of the mules, the arrieros, who carried all the produce from the mountains to the river and from the river back to the mountains. The Magdalena was the lifeline of the country. And this wild and impossible geography in time found its perfect coefficient in the topography of the Colombian spirit, which is restive and potent, at times placid and calm, in moments kind of twisted and tortured, just like a mountain that shakes and crumbles and slips to the sea. And magic then becomes the antidote to fear and uncertainty. Reality comes into focus through the reassuring lens of the phantasmagoric. The Rio Magdalena is not just the country's main artery, it's the reason Colombia can exist as a nation. It's a lifeline that allowed Colombians to settle the most tortured landscape on the earth. Within the valley of the Magdalena live 4 out of every 5 Colombians. It generates 80% of the nation's wealth. It generates the power that drives the lights of the great cities. And like the Mississippi, its shadow to the north, it's both a corridor of commerce and also a fountain of culture, the source of Colombian literature, poetry, prayer, and especially music. And through the dark times, it has served literally as a cemetery of the nation, a slurry of the shapeless dead. And yet always it returns as a river of life. And through all the years of violence, the river never abandoned the people. And this is something that people know and acknowledge. It always flowed. And there is this powerful sense throughout the country that I picked up and down the river and in every back corner and remote reach of that cuenca, where people say consistently, fishermen, musicians, politicians, and poets, to clean our soul, we must clean the river. And to clean the river is to clean our soul. And so the Magdalena is the story of Colombia. Colombia as a nation is a gift of the river. And today that story happily is one of redemption, regeneration, and hope. And one picks up these subtle signs of of this space. It's like what Lawrence Durrell said. If you want to know a people, just find a quiet place and listen to the messages of their landscape. Just as landscape holds a key to character, culture springs from the spirit of place. At the very mouth, the fishermen living in these shacks where a single wave could sweep away their lives. They fish by night using kites they make out of plastic, garbage, and twigs. And they live on a narrow jetty, on one side of which is the dark and foreboding river, once dense with corpses of the dead, on the other side, the powerful ocean. But as if in conscious rejection of despair, they decorate all their shacks with poetry. Here lives Beethoven. Here one can breathe peace, love, and tranquility. And the mammals of the Arahuacos ritualistically make payments at the mouth of the river. And traditionally, they made pilgrimages to the very source, 1,500 kilometers up country, pausing at every community to measure the consciousness of the people as a reflection of the way they treat the river itself. And from the Colombian Macizo, from the vast paramos, the unique formations of Colombia, accompanied by characters like my friend William Vargas, a botanist who can change botanical history simply by holding a blossom to the light. You travel from these extraordinary paramos down these ancient Incaic roads that fall away like mercury into the cloud forest. Women like Adelpha, the Rock of Murillo, one of those glorious Andean towns in Colombia that force you out of bed in the middle of the night just to experience the glory of the sun breaking over the village at dawn. She was a Gaitanista, a great leftist, whose life left her with the assassination of the great hope of the poor, Jorge Gaitan, in 1948. She said that that was the year that God left Murillo. But then she said to me, God returned. And the story came one evening when she told me what happened on the night that Nevado de Ruiz blew, when 35 million tons of rock and ash and ice came careening down the mountain at the speed of a locomotive. Everybody in her community gathered in the plaza. The power went out. Ash fell like black snow. People and families read the faces of their young like braille to see who was still here. And she stood like a statue, bold, proud, and simply watched determined as the entire mountain went just the other side of a ridge, and the people of Murillo escaped completely, even while communities down valley were utterly wiped out, with 35,000 dead in the community of Armero alone. And that was the night, she told me, that God returned to Murillo. The Anaconda, whose community and family farm was occupied both the FARC and the paramilitaries. A woman who said that when she was young, they couldn't even eat the fish in the river because the fish had fed on the corpses of the dead. But then those who defied the paramilitaries, the point of throwing the people in the river was to kill them twice, to physically kill them and to spiritually kill them, so to deny them the last rites of Christian faith. And yet in one community of Puerto Barreo, the fishermen said, no, we won't allow this. And even at the risk of their own lives, they defied the paramilitaries and began to bring the corpses out of the river. And they baptized them, making them the people Enes without name, baptizing them with the names of their only family members, bringing them into their own lineages, as if to say, we are here, you came to us by way of the river, and we will not forget. The armero, the man who works with the spirits of the dead in the cemetery. Continuing downriver into the fountain of Colombian music. Colombia is said to be the land of 1,000 rhythms. Ethnomusicologists have in fact identified 1,025. The mother of all the rhythms of puro, merengue, salsa, tambora is of course cumbia. But as Carlos Vivas told me, the great rock star of Colombia, the mother of cumbia is indeed the Magdalena. And music is the muse of the nation. And continuing finally down toward the river mouth itself, the great Ciénaga, the great wetland of the Sierra Nevada, Ciénaga Grande de Santa Marta, where in this floating fishing village of Nueva Venecia, which suffered one of the most horrific massacres in 2003. A village where the cats swim and the dogs are afraid of water. A village that has somehow miraculously rebounded from the great massacre of 2003, where the people were killed simply because they were caught in the vice of war, condemned if they failed to aid the guerrillas, condemned by the paramilitaries if they did. A young fisherman we met, we asked him what could the government possibly do to offer reparations for such a horrific period in your history. And at first he said, build us new houses. And then as we sketched a note, he said, no, that won't work. We need the cienega. Give back life to the cienega. And as we made notes, he said, no, that won't help. What good is that if we don't have health in the rivers that come into the cienega? And then as we wrote that down, he finally burst out, mierda, shit, what's the point? We can't do anything if we don't restore health to the Mother Magdalena herself. That's what we need. And so this is the image of Colombia today. Two lovers dancing, practicing their salsa, 3 a.m. at Cartagena. The only danger in going to Colombia today is a danger that you may never want to come home. My friend Sandero Uribe, who was my confidant, my partner, my closest friend in Colombia, critically essential to the success of this book. We were once on Monserrate, on the shrine overlooking Bogota, and she said something really amazing. She said, it's curious that we named this river Magdalena, because at the time it was named Magdalena, Maria Magdalena had a less than sterling reputation. She was known, according to Pope Gregory in the 6th century, as to be a repentant prostitute who Christ only allowed to bathe his feet with her hair out of a state of grace and forgiveness. But it turns out that Maria Magdalena was the wrong woman. For 1,500 years, the church focused its contempt on the wrong woman. It was Mary of Bethany who was the repentant prostitute, and Maria Magdalena was a simple devotee of Christ. She was with him in life, by him at his death. She was the first to witness his resurrection. It was to her that he gave the key to the kingdom. She was the one to spread the joyful news of his resurrection and redemption. And it was only in 1969 that the Catholic Church removed the scarlet letter of sin from her chest. And only in 2016, even as peace came to Colombia, Pope Francis famously anointed her the apostle of the apostles, the watchtower of Christianity. And Sandra said to me, think about that. For all of history, Maria Magdalena was viewed as a prostitute. And then in a single generation, 3 billion Catholics, Eastern Orthodox faith, Lutheran and Anglican, realized she was in fact a saint. And then Sandra said, why can't we do the same for the river? And at that moment, a small little bird landed on our table in that cafe, pecked at the crumbs, and then flew away into the rainforest. And let me finally just read you one quote from one of the characters in this book, Herman Ferro, the director of the Museum of the Magdalena in Honda, who did his PhD thesis on the muleteers that carried the wealth of Colombia for all of its history. He said, I'll never forget the moment when I first heard that the peace agreement had been signed in Havana. By chance, I was at the very confluence of the Rio Cauca and the Magdalena. The Rio Cauca is a great affluent of the river. I was completely overwhelmed by what I can only call geographical emotion, a sense of space, as if the spirits were emerging from the earth. I stripped off my clothes and placed my head in the river. As I stood in the sun, the water dripping down my naked body, I began to weep. Rivers of tears flowed as I realized that my son could grow up in a country at peace, a river that has known every tragedy, that has carried the dead and all the misery of the nation, that has suffered along with all Colombians, a river that I love so much, and there we were by its waters as peace came over the land. That's what the Magdalena means to the Colombian people. And that is what Colombia, in essence, means to the world. Thanks very much, Rebecca.
Wade, thank you so much for that. That was beautiful. You speak so lyrically about Colombia. It's just, it's almost magical to hear you speak about it. I just want to let people know at home that if you are interested in asking or getting a question to Wade, you can use the chat function on the Zoom screen and we can see them and we will try to get them to Wade as well. I do just want, and on that note, someone has already asked that they want to be able to get your bibliography of your personal library of everything you have on Colombia. So
Ah, great. That's
that's
wonderful.
one of the questions. But it actually dovetails
Let
nicely
me
into
just,
what
Rebecca, let me,
I
before
wanted to
you,
ask you first. Sorry, go
let me
on.
just, I was just going to say, that's just actually a wonderful comment because, President Juan Manuel Santos, the Nobel laureate for peace, just tweeted out unsolicited that every Colombian should read this book and we should clean up the river. The purpose of this book is that peace is precarious in Colombia right now for all kinds of reasons. And the greatest enemy of peace is despair, negativity, and pessimism. And Colombians have not just suffered physically, but also psychologically by being, how do you imagine it feels like to be a pariah nation? A friend of mine, Carolina Barco, who was the Minister of External Affairs, daughter of a president, U.S. Colombian ambassador to Washington at the time, was strip searched at Dulles Airport in Washington simply because she was a Colombian. And when she offered her diplomatic credentials, the customs guy spat out an obscenity as if bark from the mouth of a dog. Now, if that government official is treated that way, you can imagine how ordinary Colombians are treated at frontiers around the world. And it creates a psychological despair. My friend Hector Abad, whose father was assassinated in one of the killings that shook the entire nation, and he's a brilliant writer of Latin American literature. He's one of the great writers of Latin America, and he was a great journalist. And he's famously bitter about his country for obvious reasons. And he has this sort of love hate thing about Colombia. And so when he said of Magdalena, only Wade could make me, only Wade in this book could make me love Colombia again. That's what the book's about. The book is not just it's not a travel book. It's a biography of the country. As Hector said, it's a love letter to the country. And its goal is to show all that's wonderful about Colombia without hiding from the dark history, but explaining it with empathy. And the hope is, of course, that the Colombian people will see in the mirror of the book the wonder of what they really and truly are.
I'm curious if you ever worried as you're writing this book that because you say you want to make sure that Colombians know that they are the special people, the special land that they are. But do you ever worry that you somehow romanticize poverty or romanticize violence in doing that?
Not in the slightest. If you actually read, if you read the book, it goes into extraordinary and graphic detail about the violence and about the war, but and explains it within the context of Colombian history and geography. The book is anything but a sanitized version of Colombian history, but again, that history is explained in a way uh, and contextualized in a way that is fair and not simply based on meaningless and dark cliches.
And so when did you know I think your love affair with Colombia started pretty organically, it sounds like, as a young boy, and then you revisited. So at what point did it become like, this is my love affair with Colombia, but now this is a deliberate
Yeah,
part of my life that I'm going to start researching and writing about this now?
books come to you in kind of serendipitous ways, Rebecca. In this case, you know, I really, in, in Colombia, I have a reputation that is out of all proportion to the time I've actually spent in Colombia, in a sense. But One River was such an important book for Colombians. For example, when the National Library, in anticipation of the 200th anniversary of the independence of the country, started the process of selecting 200 books, the most important books in the history of the country. One River was selected as among the first 25, and it was the only book by an outsider. it's not for nothing that President Santos, in a ceremony at the National Palace, invited me to be an honorary Colombian citizen. It's very rare in the history of the country. And it began just sort of. I started going back to Colombia, in the early years, 2000, 2003, making a few films in the country, doing some photo exhibits at Smithsonian that traveled Colombia. One thing led to another. And one of the people that read One River was the head of Grupo Argos, one of Colombia's most prominent corporate citizens. And they were having their 100th anniversary or something. And he decided, why celebrate us? Let's celebrate the country. So he funded teams of botanists and photographers and journalists to do a beautiful illustrated book on each of the 5 major regions of the country. These books not to be sold, but gifted to every library in the country, again, to send a message to young Colombians that theirs was not a country of violence and war, but of the greatest biodiversity on the planet. And as I went to promote one of these at their invitation, one luncheon, I simply said very casually, well, we've covered the land, let's do the rivers. And without hesitation, the team said, fine. So what began, in fact, as a sort of a 7,000 word essay to illustrate, to promote, to for an illustrated book, grew into this kind of doorstop of a book of 430 pages. And the river just captured me. I know that as a writer, Hemingway said, I think, that anyone who says that writing is easy is either a bad writer or a liar. I mean, writing's not isn't easy. And I at least find that you need to have some kind of motivation, some passion. And for me, that's often righting some wrong. When I wrote The Serpent and the Rainbow, my first book, it was the indignation I felt that the African religion of voodoo had been dismissed in this racist way as simply a black magic cult. When I wrote Into the Silence, I wanted people to know who were forgetting what our grandparents endured in the Great War. I also wanted to tell the story of a generation seeking the summit of the world. All of my books have been driven by some kind of mission. At least that's how I get motivated. And in this case, I just felt a real need to tell the story of the Colombia that I knew. And there's kind of no corner in Colombia that I haven't seen. And I really feel strongly. My friend Sandra, for example, there's a classic story of a young Colombian. When she was 15 years old, at the height of the Escobar terror in Medellin, the family, uh, several of whom were nearly killed many times, decided, when she couldn't tell the difference in the sound of bombs or thunder, to send her to live with her grandmother in Miami, which she did. She was immediately mocked by school children in high school in Miami for being from the land of Escobar, by students whose own major social activity was the pursuit of drugs, with Colombian cocaine being the drug of choice. Sandra from Medellin had never seen, let alone use, cocaine. So there's this kind of caricature about Colombia that we have from Narcos and other, documentaries, and the obsession with Pablo Escobar, that is such a disservice to the country, and it's a particularly egregious disservice when you think that we who consume the drug are the ones who ultimately are responsible for the agony of the country. I mean, it's an agony that I recall Max Hastings talking about in one of his books, a meeting in Moscow after World War II. Individuals who would suddenly sort of flash over breakfast, over dinner. Oh, my father was in that gulag. Oh, my uncle was killed there too, as if they had discovered that their forebears had gone to the same public school together. Well, Colombia is like that. You're sitting around at a gay luncheon in Bogota, and someone says, my father was held hostage by the FARC at that Paramo, and then someone will say, oh, my sister was killed there too. I mean, it's like, it's just so general, the suffering in Colombia, which makes it all the more extraordinary, the national resilience. And it's something that I think the world, in a sense, owes something to Colombia. I mean, this is a serious nation of 50 million people. It's the strongest democracy in Latin America. Whereas at a time when the United States, for example, is separating families at the border, to the extent that right now there are 545 young kids who've been torn from their families that the US government can't even identify their whereabouts at the moment. And quietly, even as they've been faced with the challenge of a peace agreement that has a price tag of $45 billion, the Colombians, without a thought, have absorbed 1.8 million Venezuelan refugees in the biggest humanitarian crisis in the history of Latin America. And they haven't put them in cells. They've housed them, they've fed them, they've given them schooling and medical care. So Colombia deserves a hell of a lot of credit.
You know, when you speak about Colombia, you clearly, as we've been saying, are in love with this country. Your passion for it is so pure. But I'm wondering, in your travels there over the many years you spent there, in the corners that you were there, and all of the places you've been, you certainly would have seen the underbelly or the dark parts of Colombia that you speak about. Were you ever disenchanted? I mean, did you ever have a moment where you thought, okay, like I have to focus on the good? And did you find yourself getting caught up in the negative image that
Well,
that
I don't
we
know
and the
what
rest of the world have
I
seen?
don't know what you mean by the dark sides of Colombia. I mean, I've
Nope.
never been a war correspondent. I spent a lot of time on the river with a friend of mine, Juan Betancourt, who was a war correspondent, and I quote him a lot in the book, and he taught me a lot. So I mean, the early days of the conflict, I was once arrested as a Dutch gun runner, and I had some brushes with the FARC, and
I guess,
you
sorry, I guess what I just mean is, you're in a country that has a lot of poverty. It has a lot of people who are struggling with the aftermath of people being killed. And so I'm wondering if you ever got caught up in this belief that is put out there to the world that it's not the best place on the planet as you've come to believe it is.
I'm not saying it's the best place on the planet. I don't even know what that means, but I'll tell you something. I mean, the when I was a young traveler, I lived on the streets of Colombia. My budget was $3 a day, and that included money to collect my plants and send my specimens home. I mean, I lived like a campesino, and one of the things that Colombians like about me is my accent in Colombia, in Spanish rather, is very much of the street, and my modismos and the way I put words together is like a campesino, because that's the world I knew. And in all of that time, the warmth of the people just wrapped around me like a cloak. The extraordinary thing about Colombians is their generosity. People who have nothing to give nevertheless don't hesitate to give all that they have. It's the most extraordinary place in that regard. There's a lot of places in the world. This business of poverty. I mean, obviously, we want to elevate people out of poverty, but there's a very big difference between having material scarcity in your life and living a life of wretched despair. I mean, I have never in my life in abroad, and at one point when I was at the Geographic, I was traveling sometimes to 60 countries a year and doing ethnography. So I wasn't hanging out in five-star hotels. I've never met such misery, such wretched misery as I've encountered in the inner cities of the United States of America, from Baltimore and Philadelphia to Los Angeles and Houston. The capacity to find a way in life that I find, and this is not to suggest for a moment that I am not sympathetic with the aspirations for a better material way of life in Colombia for a great number of people. But Colombians aren't blind to that. They're struggling with the same issues all the time. I mean, this is a country that, has extraordinary progressive um, legislation for indigenous people, for example. I mean, to give you one example, 1985, Virgilio Barco, the president, said to a friend of mine, Martin von Hildebrand, an anthropologist, Martin, do something for the Indians. And in 5 incredible years as head of Indian Affairs, Martin did more than something. He secured legal land tenure of an area of land in the Amazon, collectively the size of the United Kingdom, for the 57 ethnicities of the Northwest Amazon. And behind a veil of isolation created by the absence of the federal state during the conflict, a whole new dream of culture was reborn. And those land rights were encoded in perpetuity in the 1991 Constitution of the country. And I dare say that Canada has never come close to equaling that record when it comes to respecting the land of Indigenous people.
You mentioned when you were talking about the selection of books that were chosen that people should read in Colombia, and yours as an outsider was included on that list. I'm curious if you consider yourself an outsider in Colombia today, or are you part of the fabric somewhat now in some way of that country?
I would never be full of myself to say that I have some, it's just a moment. It's a moment in time. It's hard to explain, because precisely because I do know the country so well, geographically, culturally, and because I know its history, um, and because I've spoken as I do speak about the nation, it's given me almost a kind of a status, like an avatar or something. I mean, I once was giving a talk at the major cultural institution in Bogota, the Biblioteca Arango, and the capacity of the hall was 400, and 5,000 people turned up. I can be in a small town like Onda, and a family will just come up to me and to thank me. Mothers and grandmothers come up and say, why can't we love our country the way you love our country? And I'll tell you, it's not the it's kind of like not the love. It's not the love of a tourist who just thinks it's cool, or some. I mean, let me read you a funny thing here. When Sandra and I were working on this book, we were in constant communication. I mean, only the conventions of publishing and the fact that I did the actual writing have left her name off the cover of the book, as I make very clear in the acknowledgments. And at the end of one really arduous series of exchanges, I sent her a note that I totally forgot about. And years later, 3 years later, a journalist in Bogota was interviewing me, and he asked me this question: what is it about Colombia that draws you? And before I could answer, Sandra pulled out from her phone, where she had recorded that note I had sent that I had long forgotten. And this is what I had written her that night. I do long for the air of Bogota, that unmistakable scent that tells me I've landed on the savannah. It's hard to explain. When I talk about loving Colombia, it's something visceral, even sensual. To be away for too long is to be on life support. To step again onto the soil of the nation is to feel instantly that very sense of belonging that so long ago gave me the freedom to envision the man I've become. Whispered messages of a landscape unlike any other. The wild embrace of a people that allowed a vagabond boy to grow into a content and realized scholar. It is the very madness of Colombia that rescued me, like a sweet coefficient of the soul. My fire was so bright, so all consuming, that I came very close to self immolation. Only Colombia could match and give purpose to my passion. I was saved by that. And this is a key if anyone wants to understand my loyalty to the country.
Hmm. There's one thing you mentioned in your talk earlier, and it was about, you briefly talked about the treatment of elders in Colombia. But then also in our talk this morning
No,
on
I
the
was talking about
show, you
the
talked
elder
about,
brother. I was talking about the elder brothers, which is the term used for the mamos or the priests of the Sierra Nevada.
oh, okay, my apologies. But I am curious about the treatment of the elderly in Colombia. Also, because in our talk this morning on the show, you talked about how in America there are so few grandparents who live with the like the family who are within the same household. And it, there seems to be, and now we're having these conversations in Canada about long-term care and why do we not care about our elderly, and just knowing in other parts of the world the treatment of people who are older is much different than it is in North America. I was curious to hear how grandparents are treated in
Well, I
that
mean,
society and what we
obviously,
can learn from them.
yeah, I mean, obviously, Colombia is a very complicated place with, I mean, it's rural, urban. Bogota is as sophisticated as New York, and yet you can reach, settlements that feel like they're still almost frozen in the 17th century. That's the charm of the country. You can, I mean, that's sort of the magic of it. And I'll get back to your, but to give you a sense of that the way it works in Colombia, you know, uh, I was with the Mamos, and when we went to make the ritual payment at the mouth of the river, um, Mamo Camillo asked me innocently if I was willing to be, could I find a way to be with them in 4 days in their village in the mountains when President Juan Manuel Santos was going to visit for the first time. And I said, well, you know, I'll do my best, knowing full well logistically the only way I could have joined them would be to hitch a ride on the presidential airplane and helicopter. And so I made some phone calls and I got a message back from the Palacio Nariño from the president saying through a friend that he'd be delighted to have Profi Davis come along. So I flew from Barranquilla down to Bogota. A soldier brought me over to the presidential jet, and the president arrived with the ministers, and we flew back up to Valledupar to pick up the helicopters. And en route, the aides were peppering him with statistics as to what he should say in his national speech that was to be broadcast from that village. And I sort of quietly put up my hand and said, you know, in Spanish, Presidente, you know, los datos no valen nada para ellos. No, you know, statistics don't mean anything for them. It's what's in your heart that counts. And then I told him what Mama Camillo had said about peace not mattering if it is just an excuse to maintain a war against nature. Well, the president made that the theme of his speech. And as we were in the men's sacred temple with the all the ministers and the elders, he started to introduce his party and he got around to me and he was very generous and warm and kind with what he said. But he was interrupted by one of the main mamos who said, no, you don't have to tell us about that guy. He's our ambassador in Washington, D.C. Because I guess in a way I was. And then we had a big laugh about that. And then I, you know, the president gave that great speech. And then we all flew back to Bogota just in time for me to catch another flight to Barranquilla, where that night my daughter in her cumbia band from Medellin was singing on stage in front of 10,000 people with Carlos Vivas, which was amazing. Then I flew back to Medellin, and word came that President Uribe, the bitter rival of Santos, wanted to see me. So I took my car up. My driver took me up to his hacienda, and I was told there was going to be this great party fiesta. Maybe I'd get in word about cleaning up the river. Well, when I got there, only President Uribe's wonderful wife, Lina Moreno, was on the front step waiting to invite me in. And she said to me, have you had lunch? And I ended up having a nice Sunday lunch with the family and the grandchildren. And with President Uribe, we toured the country. There's no place he doesn't know. And then he said, okay, Profi, let's talk about the river. My point is that, you know, that's a 48-hour period where you can have access to a president and the president will actually listen to a native elder in that profound way. So that there's this huge inner fertility between the intellectuals and the politicians and indigenous people even that is not perfect, but it's quite remarkable nevertheless. And you know the incredible rich traditions of science. So back to your original question about you know elders. I mean, obviously, in an urban center like Bogota, you have the same challenges we have in, you know, with longevity and what becomes of family members who are suddenly in their 90s and perhaps, you know, suffering from dementia or other afflictions. But in general, the family remains in Colombia, as in much of Latin America, the sacred unit of the society. And the idea of simply dumping off the grandparents into retirement homes, as we 94% of us do in North America. There's only 6% of North American homes, as I mentioned this morning on the radio, that have grandparents and grandchildren beneath the same roof. That's not what you would find in Colombia. You know, families may not all be under the same roof, but grandparents are not shunted away into homes where they're never visited. I mean, the family is everything in Colombia.
I have a question here from someone who wonders when you're going to return to Colombia.
Well, I was in Colombia on March 3rd. You know, I recorded the audio version of the book in a studio in Medellin. And, you know, I teach at UBC in the fall. So, you know, COVID has sort of like all of us, it both took my schedule to the car wash. I was supposed to be in 7 countries, giving 30 presentations and launching the book, et cetera. but I've enjoyed actually staying put for the first time since I was 13 years old. But I am very keen to get back to Colombia. I mean, one of the wonderful things, Rebecca, about the Zoom universe is our ability to communicate from home. It's just, I mean, just last Friday, I testified at the Colombian Senate, the Congress, in favor of legalization of coca leaves, which is a big initiative that we have. I'm working on a major project about coca. We're working on a IMAX film. I'm working as a consultant for Pro Colombia, the tourism agency of the federal government. I'm in close touch with political leaders, and doing anything I can to facilitate the peace agreement. I'm going to be doing a session with ex-presidente Juan Manuel Santos in a couple of weeks, a Zoom kind of webinar, the two of us. So, it's a wonderful thing about the Zoom universe. We can't actually be with each other, but I mean, the efficiencies of it are just extraordinary. I mean, I've been doing 4 and 5 webinar events like we're doing right now together, Rebecca, every day since August 6th. It's just been amazing, the ability to reach out to the world through this new technology.
I have a question here from Stephanie Wolcott, who says, how can we protect the social and environmental leaders who are being threatened in Colombia right now?
That is an excellent question. Let me explain a little bit about what went wrong with the peace agreement. Juan Manuel Santos, well, let me go back even. In 2002, Colombia was essentially a failed state. And Alvaro Uribe was elected on a hardline stance, a hard hand, un mano duro. And his defense minister was Santos. And probably the only helpful massive US intervention in any country since World War II that I can think of was in fact Plan Colombia. And Plan Colombia came about, traditionally you had the CIA in Colombia fighting Cold War ghosts in their concerns about these small leftist groups. And you had the DEA fighting the drug trafficking. And the CIA thought the DEA were doing police work. The DEA couldn't believe the CIA was chasing Cold War ghosts when tons of cocaine were turning up in the streets of America. And once the two things came together with the realization that they were linked in the term narco-terrorists, then the floodgates of American aid opened up to the point where Colombia became the third largest recipient of foreign aid in the world from the United States after Egypt and Israel. And the Colombians used that money well. They quadrupled the size of the army, they professionalized the army, and they let the guerrillas and the paramilitaries know that the field of play had changed. Now, in 2006, Uribe, like Nixon going to China, demilitarized the paramilitaries. Now, he didn't eliminate them. They were, after all, his constituency to some extent, but he eliminated them as an open marauding force in the war. And only he could have done that. And the terms by which he did that were lenient in the extreme. But again, the paramilitaries were not about to come out of the woods to enter a jail cell. And to understand who the paramilitaries are, and they were responsible for 80% of the violence, is that the Colombian army before Plan Colombia had about 100,000 men in it and women. It wasn't big enough to monitor this massive country. And so individual ranchers, farmers took it upon themselves, the wealthy landowners in particular, to create their own defense militias. It became known as the Auto Defense Forces. And the FARC and the ELN and the M19 and other leftist groups could strike anywhere in the country they chose to do. The paramilitaries couldn't be everywhere, and they had to have their presence everywhere. Their goal was to deny supplies to the leftist guerrillas. And so, because they physically couldn't be everywhere, they made terror present everywhere. And if you tie people to a tree, cut them up with a chainsaw, throw the parts in the Magdalena River, the message gets around. And it was the need to neutralize that inspired Uribe to do that. Now, when Santos became president, he turned all of his energy into the quest for peace. And he did in his negotiations with the FARC. And again, remember what I said. The last year of the war, they made $600 million. They weren't going to walk out of the hills and simply enter a jail cell. So similarly, the terms of reference that brought the FARC to the peace table in Havana were, by the opinion of many Colombians who had suffered, those on the right, too lenient. But they were the only way he was going to stop this war going on forever. Unfortunately, he put the vote for the treaty to a referendum. He legally didn't have to do that. He wanted a kind of a sense of national solidarity. To everybody's surprise, that vote narrowly was defeated by literally handful of votes. And the international community that very week gave him the Nobel Prize, which gave him a certain status, which allowed him to go back to Congress and quite legally, as he could have done at any time, put the treaty through, which he did. But that arose the ire of the right. And because of constitutionally, he couldn't run for another term. And Ivan Duque, the protege of Alvaro Uribe, running from the right, split a divided field on the left and became president, even though he was committed to, if not dismantling completely, certainly weakening the terms of the peace agreement. And even though rates of homicide in Colombia had dropped in 1 year to rates not seen since the early 1970s. Now, the peace agreement itself had hundreds of clauses at a cost of $45 billion. Right at that moment, oil prices dropped in Colombia, their main source of foreign currency, and the humanitarian crisis happened with Venezuela. And so the federal state lacked the wherewithal and failed utterly, in part because of lack of leadership, to get the army into those vast reaches of the country that had been abandoned by the FARC when they laid down their arms. What did go into those regions were all the bandidos, all the disaffected FARC, and all the small cartels that had no interest in a federal presence because they wanted to maintain their illicit activities. Again, cocaine, the fuel of conflict in Colombia. And meanwhile, individual civic leaders stood up and thinking that they were free in this new era of Colombia to demand from the government the implementation of the agreement, which included mostly progress on basic infrastructure, road improvement, school, potable water, just what the FARC had fought for all those years. And because the federal state was not there, those heads started getting chopped off. And so while the overall blanket of peace has made Colombia a peaceful country, individual killings have been disturbingly high, up to maybe 700 individuals from civil society killed since the agreement. And this is what makes the peace process so precarious. I think the country is exhausted by war. It will never go back to what was, but the pursuit of peace will continue to be as elusive and challenging as it has been throughout Colombian history.
I'm just curious. So it's 8:05. How much time do you have? You can take a couple more questions, or if you
I'm fine.
had it.
No, I'm fine. I'm happy.
You're
I
good?
love. Yeah, Rebecca, you're great, and the people have been politely listening. I'm happy to answer
Okay.
some questions.
Okay,
I
because
mean, one of the
I do
great
have a
things
couple
about
more here.
one of the great things, Rebecca, about COVID is who's got anywhere to go.
This is a fact. Okay. Okay, so the question I have here is from Mark, and he says, what do you think about the relationship between the cultural diversity and the biodiversity of Colombia? Is it the biodiversity that leads to the cultural diversity, or does the cultural diversity help shape the biodiversity, or is it more complex than that?
Well, Colombia's geography is and its location is probably responsible for its immense biodiversity. I mean, it is at the crossroads of continents, and so, floristically, for example, you have the flora of Central America trying to push south into South America. You have the Andean flora. You have the expanses of the Amazon, and then these great, extraordinary prairie formations, eastern llanos, north of the Amazon. You have the Andes, this, three arms of the Andes separated by deep valleys. Um, and then also, of course, the fact that the Amazon used to flow to the Pacific, right? And the Andean Cordillera is relatively recent. It's only about 40 million years old. And as it rose, it cut off a big chunk of the Amazon, which is the Colombian Pacific department of the Choco, which is its own whole universe. In fact, right now we're fighting the construction of a deep water port in the Gulf, El Golfo de Tribuga, which is the highest center of species endemism ever recorded in the world. So part of this, and again, for example, the paramos, these mysterious formations that seem to come out of a children's book, a Scottish moorland grafted onto the heights of the Andes of South America. It's because further south in Peru at those heights, you have this sort of dry puna formations of various grasses, useful for grazing alpaca, but pretty impoverished ecosystems in terms of biodiversity. But as you get further north, at those altitudes, you get constant rain. So you have these incredible formations, unique in the world. And there are some paramos in Ecuador and a few in the on the in the Cordillera Oriental on the Venezuela side, but the vast majority of the world's paramos are unique to Colombia. So there's all of that, and then there's all the diversity of topography that has obviously led as well to the diversity of culture. It's interesting when most people think of the Spanish conquest, they're sort of enchanted by Cortez's struggles with the Aztec and Pizarro's attack on the Inca. The amazing thing is as if Colombia, was a sideshow or something. The truth of the matter is that Colombia sent more gold and precious stones to the coffers of Spain than Peru did. And the conquest of Peru was relatively easy. I mean, Pizarro met the Inca simply by walking across the sands at Tumbes on his first landing. The conquistadores who eventually conquered Colombia had to fight their way to the homeland of the Muisca, enduring all the hell that is legendary in the annals of the conquest. And so Colombia has had this diversity, and again, the expanse of it. I mean, think of again, the main trunk of the Amazon, for example, has been settled for 400 years. You go up the Amazon, with the exception of the forests in the delta itself, the banks of the river all the way up to Manaus and beyond have been essentially deforested for cattle ranches and a long time ago. But the Colombian Amazon, protected from the west by the Andean Cordillera, which was not pierced by roads until the 1930s and 40s, and from the east by these great cataracts that have limited river traffic. So you have an expansive forest literally the size of France. And also in Colombia, you have these incredible remnants of the ancient pre-Andean Guyana Shield, and you have these great tapuis. If anybody's seen a picture of Angel Falls, well, you have those same formations in Colombia. In fact, the largest tropical park in the world, which President Santos doubled in size, is the extraordinary Chiribiquete at the headwaters of the Rio Ajajo and Macaya and Apaporis. I mean, it's just so beautiful. It's like a lost world, right? So all of these things come together to give Colombia this unbelievable. Look, let me put it this way: for a botanist in Canada to discover a new species would require an act of God. My friend William has found over 100 in his short career. I'll tell you, I once was with this great friend of mine. I called him Morita de los Manatees. He was kind of this poor field hand who kind of fell in love with manatees, and he would keep them alive in periods of drought. He thought they were his spiritual power. He was a classic Colombian in that sense, dancing in the realm of the phantasmagoric all the time. And we were out together around a little wetland, a ciénaga, and he always worked with the school kids. It was near a place called Savana de Torres. And he casually said to me one day, you know, hermano, we found 75 species of butterflies, the kids and me, right around this little pond. And I said, carajo, hombre, es la mitad de que tenemos en Canada. It's half of what we have in all of Canada, or a third. I mean, you know. And then he said the classic Colombian response. He said, ah, sí, pero la cosa, hermano, es que en Colombia un mariposa es solamente un flor que puede volar. Es por eso que tenemos tanto. Ah, my friend, my brother. Yeah, the thing is this in Colombia, a butterfly is just a flower that's learned how to fly. That's why we've got so many. And that sums up Colombia so beautifully.
We have another question here. I just can't seem to find it at the moment, but the gist of it was, what can we learn about how Colombia values its waterways? How can we transfer that to what we have here to better protect them in Canada?
Well, I mean, Colombia hasn't valued its waterways, which is kind of the purpose of this book. I mean, one of the extraordinary things, Rebecca, that COVID has taught us clearly, is that we're all biological beings on a living planet. As I said on the show this morning, this strange viral pathogen, 10,000 times smaller than a grain of sand, commandeered our cells, transforming our own biology even as it attacked the connectivity of community that is for social species, its protection, just as teeth and claws are for the tiger. Um, but at the same time, as the industrial world shut down, we saw the fecundity of the world. Those amazing images of wild boar in the streets of Barcelona, the canals of Venice clear, rivers in Medellin running through the city like trout streams, the sky over the Himalaya of Delhi and Karachi and Kathmandu clear for the first time in 2 generations. We saw the abundance of nature. And, rivers are like that. I mean, their capacity for regeneration is extraordinary. I mean, look at the River Hudson. A really good friend of mine and another lover of Colombia is Bobby Kennedy Jr. When his dad was assassinated, the family sent him to live on a farm, a ranch in the Llanos with a friend and escape the media frenzy. And, Bobby has told me many times we're kind of like brothers. We've known each other for 40 years. And, the River Hudson was so polluted that you could tell what kind of car they were making at the GM plant at Terrytown from the color of the river. Today, you can't eat the fish because of the concentration of heavy metals, which will take a century to remove. But there is the richest fishery in terms of species on any river on the east coast of North America is now the River Hudson. Humpback whales have been seen at its mouth from Manhattan. Children can play on the beaches and families can swim in the river, unheard of a generation ago. What about the River Thames in London? In 1967, the Natural History Museum declared it a totally dead, biologically dead entity, not even any oxygen in it. Today, there are 125 species of fish in the River Thames. Dolphins can be seen beneath the bridges of London. All you have to do to bring back the life of a river is to stop putting shit into it. And, it's interesting when you think of how precious fresh water is. All the water on Earth, if you put it into a gallon jug, what's available for us to drink wouldn't fill a teaspoon. People don't understand that water can change states becoming gas or ice or liquid. But water is never created nor destroyed. The same amount of water on Earth that slaked the thirst of dinosaurs is the water that we have today. It's all based on the hydrological cycle. And when the mammals of the Arhuacos say that the blood in our body is the same as the water in the rivers, they're not really speaking in metaphor. All of us will die. And when we do, that blood, which makes up at least 2/3 of our weight, will indeed slip into the soil and find its way to the sea as effortlessly as the water of a river runs away to the ocean. And 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 so to heal the Rio Magdalena, all we have to do is stop putting crap into it. It seems so ironic to me that, we in the Christian faith, for example, we baptize our children with, water in the form of a cross over the brow, or we literally dump them into basins of purified sacred water, that they may emerge transformed, blessed with the possibility of salvation and eternal life. And we draw that water from living bodies of rivers and lakes that we then turn around and abuse in ways that can only be seen to be shameful. The Rio Magdalena could be cleaned up so readily. And the way we're promoting it in Colombia is not as an environmental movement, for more regulation, more interference by government. We're promoting it as a statement of patriotism, of patrimony, because the river is the country is the river. And incidentally, Colombia is the only nation state in the world whose revolution was sparked by a vision of natural history. Simon Bolivar, who, as opposed to George Washington, liberated an entire continent, carried in his saddlebags, as he rode 75,000 miles over the course of that revolution, the journals and the maps of Alexander von Humboldt. When Humboldt spoke of nature as a universe to be protected, he was speaking to some extent in metaphor, but Simon Bolivar took him quite literally. And Colombia was born in a vision of natural history. So we're calling for the cleaning up of the river as an essential act of patriotism, because if Colombia exists because of its beauty and its natural history, the purest act of patriotism is the protection of that heritage. And the unnecessary destruction of that heritage is nothing less than an act of treason.
I have another question here, and I suspect this might be the last one because we are getting to the end of the time. But Cynthia wants to know if you can touch on the coffee industry in Colombia and its relationship to the environment.
Well, I mean, the coffee industry has deep roots in Colombia. It's, coffee, obviously at one point was responsible for deforestation, particularly in departments like Antioquia, Caldas. Right now, I would probably suspect that most of of Colombia's coffee production is being grown in well established fincas, like the one that my friend Sandra's family has, one of the most beautiful coffee farms in all of Colombia. What's causing deforestation in Colombia is cocaine production. And again, this is why we're pushing to decouple coca leaf from cocaine. The campesinos are going to grow coca. It's probably 1,000 times more lucrative than any other cultigen. And there are vast acreages where if coca was legal, it could be grown. And they would have a crop that they could grow and participate in a legal market for coca as a nutraceutical. It's the most benign stimulant, the most valuable stimulant, the most remarkably effective mild stimulant. It has none of the negative side effects of coffee or tea or even chocolate. And it's chock full of vitamins. I mean, one of the interesting things, Rebecca, is that efforts to eradicate coca fields began 50 years before there was a cocaine problem. What happened is that physicians in Lima looked up into the mountains in the 1920s and saw illiteracy, poor nutrition, various social pathologies. And because issues of land distribution and economic inequity came too close to challenging the bourgeois foundations of their own lives in Lima, they settled on coca as the culprit, and every conceivable ill was blamed on this plant. And so when efforts to eradicate the fields began, when inspection tours from the United Nations arrived to study the problem, they announced at the airport upon their arrival that coca had to be eradicated. And during all of those years, those physicians never bothered to do the obvious, a simple nutritional assay of the plant to see what it had in it. We did that for the first time in the 1970s for the USDA, and what we found horrified our backers at the US government. Yes, coca leaf has a small amount of the alkaloid, half to 1% dry weight, absorbed benignly and gently through the mucous membranes of the mouth. I mean, if you extracted caffeine into a pure alkaloid and smoked it injected it or snorted it, you'd have a drug abuse problem. It's an axiom of of pharmacology that the purer the drug, the greater the potential for abuse. But taken in natural form, coca is a benign stimulant that is chock full of vitamins. So when the mamos take their daily dose or their daily consumption of coca, they're absorbing all the necessary vitamin or vitamin requirements as deemed necessary by the FDA. The plant also has more calcium in it than any other plant studied by science, perfect for an Andean diet that traditionally lacked a milk product. It also has enzymes which enhance the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, again, perfect for the traditional tuber crop diet of the Andes. And so, in one elegant assay that could have been done any time in those 50 years, we put into stark profile these draconian efforts that are underway to this day to destroy the fields of a plant that's been used with no evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, as the divine leaf of immortality for 4,000 years. And it begs the question, why should Colombians tolerate the imposition of policies of a foreign country whose citizens, for whatever reason, choose to choose to use a drug best used to numb the senses, to pull a tooth by your dentist? Why should a country full of people who choose that path be able to impose its own way on a country like Colombia, spraying the fields from the air, risking the lives of Colombian children, and also threatening the greatest national asset of the country, its indescribable and unequaled biodiversity? It's time for Colombia to reclaim a stolen heritage, celebrating coca for what it is, not a drug, but indeed the sacred plant of Pachamama, the divine leaf of immortality. And if we could create a global nutraceutical market for the use of coca leaf, that market would dwarf the economic revenues of the entire coffee industry of Colombia.
Wow. Um, I, I, I think I want to give you the last word. I don't know if there's anything that didn't come out that you want to come out before you go, but it's been amazing to this point. But if there's anything else you want to add, feel free to add it now.
Well, no, I think if people want to get a sense of the beauty, Rebecca, of Colombia, we made a film, Martin and I, my brother to whom I dedicate this book, with the indigenous people, the Barasan and Macuna. We made a couple of them, but a recent one we made for national Caracol in Colombia, which is sort of the big media company in Colombia, is called El Sandero de la Anaconda, the Path of the Anaconda. And you can find it on Netflix. It was released in theaters in 17 cities and became the most watched documentary in the history of Colombia. And it's not even that great a film, to be honest with you, but it has the most extraordinary visuals because of the skill of a young Colombian filmmaker, friend of mine, Will Vela, who does a lot of work in Toronto now in Hollywood films, but he is an incredible cinematographer with an amazing skill with the drone. And it just, you see that film and you'll see why you want to go to Colombia. I mean, I tell you, the only reason to be worried about going to Colombia is that you may never want to come home.
Okay. Wade Davis, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. We really appreciate it. And I know if everyone could stand up and applaud you right now, they would. So I'll do a round of applause for you by myself. Thank you so much. Well, we have a couple of people here. All right,
Really
Wade Davis.